One of the coolest books I ever read was a book called I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. The, the title and premise of the book was made famous in that somewhat inferior film, I Am Legend, one of the Will Smith vessels of a few years ago. A sort of generic action flick trying to be something exciting. Wasn't quite. Now here's the thing though about that movie. It was the third attempt by people to try and adapt that the book I Am Legend to film. The second time, Charlton Heston played the main character in the movie. It was called Omega Man. I haven't seen that one, but I did just finish watching The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price, which was the adaptation that happened nearest to when the book was released in 1954. And it happened in kind of a golden age of movies being slow. Which matters because the premise of the book, I Am Legend, is that there was a 100% effective vampire virus that infected everybody and left one person alive for some reason. He just had a natural immunity and he was the only one. It's a slow book. It's supposed to be a slow book. It's just a slow story. A story about one person and being the only person left. It's a slow story. So being made in the 50s and starring Vincent Price, it kind of works. So actually, I don't know if the movie was made in the 50s, but the book was. And Vincent Price was sort of operating in that same time period. 64. So The Last Man on Earth came out in 64. Still, that time period, people were just sort of like capable of sitting down and actually sort of like having a tense experience in a movie theater. Didn't have to be exciting. Well, they derived excitement not from the overreaction of actors and overreaction of actors to what was going on around them. People were able to go to a film and have a sequence that was a long period of just sort of like slowly gaining recognition of what's happening by just watching a guy go through his morning routine and sort of slowly seeing that there are little things wrong with that morning routine. It's just a normal thing. He gets up, he goes, gets coffee, then he checks his generator. That's fine, but his windows are boarded up. Then he goes and checks his lathe to make sure that he can get the steaks lathed, and then he goes outside and he has no neighbors. That's a sequence that in the Vincent Price film was slow and calm, and you only slowly got an idea of what was going on. When I say that I have mixed feelings about that, I don't know if I said that. I have mixed feelings about this film. I thought it very hard, and so it kind of felt as if maybe it had gone into the internet already. Just the thought that I have mixed feelings about this movie. I have mixed feelings about the movie because the book is cool, but and the film did a great adaptation. It did a good adaptation of the movie up until the part where the movie is, or where the book is most weak. The place where the movie is most weak is also the place where the book is most weak, because this is a book that has like a really fun premise for a book to explore, but a premise with an inherent problem. Because the premise is, how do we cope with the day-to-day drudgery of a world where the entire population has been turned into vampires? If that's the premise, your conflict is gone already, just in the premise. most of that book is slow and quiet. Most of this movie is slow and quiet. It has this problem that there isn't a plot mechanism initially, in that there isn't sort of like an action that inspires the beginning of the real activity, the real plot movement. The book has the same problem. It's just sort of like we're just sort of plodding along, and in the book, what occurs to make the new things happen are either like just sort of like random stuff, or the more interesting things are when the main character just sort of like decides that he doesn't decide. He breaks under the stress of living in this peculiar situation. In a book that works fine, in a movie that shouldn't work fine, but what was great about The Last Man on Earth was how Vincent Price was able to articulate how it would look for a guy to just sort of like slowly snap under the pressure. I mean, it happens, you're just sort of like doing a repetitive thing, living a repetitive life, and then just sort of like one day it just sort of, it's just too much and you just sort of dissolve. And that was gorgeously done in this movie. The book falls apart at a point when I think that Richard Matheson had basically realized that he'd exhausted the premise. He'd exhausted the premise, and he'd written himself to a point where he really just needed to end it somehow. So the ending is weak. In my opinion, the ending of that book is weak because he just sort of has to. He just has to wrap up what he's got going. He just can't just keep dealing with that drudgery. It's a book about drudgery, but you have to end it somewhere, and he did. He just wrote the last few chapters in tone and in detail and in being interesting. The last few chapters of that book don't really work, in my opinion. They don't really fit very well with the rest of the really gritty, grinding bulk of the novel. The Last Man on Earth has a similar problem, but it's odd because the way that Vincent Price and the guys who adapted the book to this movie decided to deal with this problem is different than the way that Matheson dealt with it in the book. It's similar, but it has a different quirk right at the last second. And neither of them work. I don't know if there's a way to... And it kind of gets me wondering why I was so impressed with that. I mean, I know why I was impressed with that book, but I don't know. I now have sort of a demonstration of what was wrong, most fundamentally flawed about that book, by somebody taking the same story, adapting it very closely, and then deciding to just sort of like try and solve one of the fundamental problems with an experiment that I think didn't work very well. It is odd too because while I was watching this film, I don't know very much about Vincent Price as a person, but I was getting the feeling from this movie that he had he decided that he was going to have some say in how they proceeded with this adaptation, because some of the stuff that was slightly altered was altered to make Vincent Price look cool. Anyway, so now there's a go. I guess I was glad to watch it. But I don't know. The very ending of the book, I Am Legend, is one of the coolest lines it's a culmination to one of the coolest lines of poetry that is cool because of how it's informed by the rest of the novel. Which, because this movie was changed from that, it felt unsatisfying. Which is probably just because of the day that I'm watching it. I guess what I'm suggesting is go and read the book I Am Legend.